What if I told you Europe didn't conquer Africa because Africa was weak, but because Africa was dangerous? Dangerous to power. Dangerous to wealth. Dangerous to the idea that only one civilization deserved to rule the world. Now here's the contrast. You know Rome. You know Greece. You know medieval Europe. You know Napoleon, Caesar, Alexander. These names feel familiar. Safe. Repeated. They don't teach you this for a reason. Let me start by saying this plainly. If African kingdoms were weak, Europe wouldn't have spent centuries obsessing over them. Think about that for a second. Sit with it. Empires don't cross oceans, drain treasuries, lose soldiers, and rewrite moral frameworks just to bully backward societies. That story never really made sense. And deep down, you know it. But what if I told you that, at the same time Europe was burning witches and emptying its streets during plagues, African kingdoms were running international trade networks, producing military technology Europe copied, and forcing European powers to negotiate like nervous juniors? Not invade. Negotiate. And here's the part that should bother you. Why don't we know their names the same way? That's not an accident. This documentary isn't about Africa was great once nostalgia. I hate that framing. It sounds defensive, apologetic, like we're asking permission to feel proud. No. This is about power. Real power. Measured power. The kind that makes Europe hesitate. The kind that changes maps. The kind that gets erased deliberately because memory itself is a weapon. Let me show you what I mean. The kingdom that made Europe kneel, Mali. You've probably heard the name Mansa Musa. Maybe. Usually reduced to a meme. The richest man who ever lived. Gold everywhere. Gold crashing economies. Cute trivia. But that's like calling the atomic bomb a loud firecracker. Here's what they don't tell you. Mali wasn't rich by accident. It was rich because it controlled something Europe desperately needed and could not replace. Gold. Not luxury gold. Not jewelry gold. Monetary gold. The kind that backs currencies. The kind kings need to pay armies and fund wars. By the 14th century, Mali controlled over half of the known world's gold supply. Let that sink in. Half. Not Africa's gold. The world's. Europe didn't have alternatives. They didn't have Australia yet. They didn't have the Americas yet. They had Mali. Now think about leverage. Imagine one country today controlling half of the world's oil, or half of the world's semiconductors. That country wouldn't need to threaten anyone. The threat would be implied. That was Mali. When Mansa Musa went on pilgrimage to Mecca, he didn't just travel. He performed power. He arrived with an entourage so large it disrupted entire economies. Gold in Cairo that the value of gold dropped for years. People laugh at that story like it's reckless generosity. But think about it this way. If you can destabilize foreign economies just by giving gifts, you're not showing off. You're signaling dominance. Europe heard about this. Venice heard about this. Genoa heard about this. The Vatican heard about this. Maps from Europe started labeling Mali with gold symbols. literal gold symbols. That's not admiration. That's fixation. And here's the part that should unsettle you. Europe didn't try to invade Mali at first. They tried to reach it. They sent explorers, merchants, diplomats, not conquerors. Why? Because Mali's army wasn't a joke. They fielded tens of thousands of professional soldiers, cavalry units with armor, organized command structures, logistics, supply lines. This wasn't tribal skirmishing. This was state warfare. Europe at the time couldn't project power that far inland. Not safely. Not without permission. So they waited. They studied. They mapped. And when they finally returned centuries later with gunpowder, ships, and a global system built on extraction, they didn't say, "We're here for revenge." They said, "Africa was always poor." That lie only works if you don't know the truth. Songhai, the empire that outgrew Europe's imagination. If Mali was powerful, Songhai was terrifying. Songhai didn't just inherit Mali's wealth. It improved the system. Let me explain. Most people think empires rise by conquering land. Songhai rose by mastering administration. They standardized weights and measures. They enforced laws across massive territories. They created professional bureaucracies. Sound familiar? It should. That's what modern states do. Under Askia Muhammad, Songhai built an empire larger than Western Europe. Not symbolically larger, physically larger. And here's the contrast that matters. While Europe was fragmented into feuding kingdoms that couldn't agree on anything, Songhai ran centralized governance across thousands of miles. They taxed trade efficiently. They protected merchants. They invested in education. Timbuktu wasn't a myth. It was a university city. Libraries, scholars, legal debates, astronomy, medicine. Europe likes to pretend the Renaissance was self-generated. It wasn't. European scholars traveled to Islamic and African centers of learning, copied manuscripts, translated texts, then came home and pretended they'd invented everything. Here's a question for you. If Africa had no history, why did Europe study it in secret? Songhai's military mattered too. Massive infantry. Riverine naval forces along the Niger. Organized ranks. Strategy. When Morocco finally invaded Songhai in 1591, it wasn't a fair fight. Morocco had firearms supplied through European trade. Songhai had tradition and numbers. This is important. Songhai didn't fall because it was weak. It fell because Europe changed the rules of warfare globally. And once that happened, the narrative flipped. See, Africa can't govern itself. Convenient timing. Ethiopia, the Christian kingdom Europe couldn't touch. Now let's move east. Ethiopia ruins another European myth. The myth that Africa was always rather pagan, isolated. Ethiopia was Christian before most of Europe led that land. While parts of Europe were still negotiating whether Christianity would even survive, Ethiopia had an established church, monarchy, and written tradition. And Europe knew it. They called it Prestajon. a mythical Christian king in Africa. They were obsessed with finding him, not for friendship, for alliance. Why? Because Ethiopia was powerful enough to matter geopolitically. They defeated Muslim armies repeatedly. They controlled trade routes between Africa, Arabia, and the Indian Ocean. They minted their own coins. And when Portugal tried to influence Ethiopia, it didn't go smoothly. Ethiopian rulers weren't impressed. They went desperate. They expelled missionaries who overstepped. Fast forward to the 19th century. Europe is carving up Africa like meat. Berlin Conference. Lines on maps. Everyone takes a piece. Everyone except Ethiopia. Italy tried to invade. They lost. Not metaphorically. Militarily. Decisively. The Battle of Adwa in 1896 shocked Europe. An African army defeated a modern European force using strategy, numbers, terrain, and intelligence. Newspapers went silent. Or furious. Because if one African state could do that, the whole racial hierarchy story collapses. So they downplayed it. They always do. Benin, art, still, and a state too organized to control. Now let's talk about Benin. Not the modern country. The kingdom of Benin in what is now southern Nigeria. Benin was clean, planned, urban. European visitors wrote about wide streets, sophisticated city design, and governance systems that put some European towns to shame. And the art. The Benin bronzes weren't primitive. They were technically advanced. Complex casting techniques. Detailed historical records in metal. Europe couldn't replicate them easily. So what did they do? They stole them. In 1897, Britain launched a punitive expedition. That phrase alone tells you everything. They burned Benin City, killed thousands, looted art, then displayed it in museums as trophies. Then they told the world Africans didn't have civilization. Think about that contradiction. Why loot what has no value? Benin wasn't conquered because it was backward. It was destroyed because it was structured, wealthy, and unwilling to submit. The Zulu shock, when Europe met African military genius. Fast forward again. Southern Africa. The Zulu Kingdom. Shaka Zulu is often portrayed as a savage warlord. That's lazy. And intentional. Shaka was a military innovator. He restructured armies. Introduced disciplined regiments. Short stabbing spears. Tight formations. Psychological warfare. He turned a regional group into a force that reshaped southern Africa. And when the British finally fought the Zulu at Isandwana in 1879, they didn't expect what happened next. They lost. Badly. British troops with rifles were overwhelmed by Zulu strategy, speed, and coordination. This wasn't myth. This was documented. Officers killed. Flags captured. Britain eventually won through sheer industrial capacity. But the shock lingered. Once again, Europe learned something uncomfortable. Africans could adapt, innovate, win. So the story had to change. The Dogon question that still has no comfortable answer. Let me slow down here. Because this part is different. Empires threatening Europe makes sense. Armies, gold, trade, power. That fits the usual story of history. But the Dogon don't fit neatly anywhere. And that's exactly why they make people nervous. Here's the question I want to drop in your head first, before any explanation. How does a farming society, living on cliffs in Mali, describe invisible stars that European telescopes wouldn't confirm until centuries later? Not guess. Not vaguely reference. Describe. Think about it. Sit with it for a moment. If this were Greece, we'd call it proto-science. If it were Europe, we'd call it early astronomy. Because it's Africa, we're told it's coincidence, or myth, or contamination. That difference matters. Who the Dogon were, really? The Dogon people lived along the Bandiagara escarpment in present-day Mali. Cliff dwellers, farmers, mask makers, oral historians. No metal observatories, no glass lenses, no written astronomical textbooks. And yet, woven into their religious system, rituals, and cosmology was a detailed understanding of the Sirius star system. Not just Sirius, the bright star you can see with the naked eye, but Sirius B. Here's why that's a problem. Sirius B is a dense, faint companion star, a white dwarf. It's invisible to the naked eye. You need advanced telescopes to detect it. European astronomers officially confirmed Sirius B in the 19th century. The Dogon had been talking about it long before. They described Sirius as a system, not a single star. A companion star that was incredibly heavy. An orbital period of roughly 50 years. That last part is especially uncomfortable. Because it's correct. Now, here's where people usually rush in with explanations. They must have learned it from Europeans. Okay. Let's think that through. The contamination argument, examined honestly. This is where I take a clear stance. The contamination argument is possible. But it's not as clean as people pretend. Yes, French anthropologists studied the Dogon in the 1930s. Yes, information can travel. But here's the issue. The Dogon cosmology wasn't a casual story someone overheard and repeated. It was embedded in ritual calendars, encoded in maths and symbols, passed through priestly lineages. This wasn't trivial. It was sacred structure. Think about it this way. You don't casually absorb advanced astrophysics from a passing outsider and then integrate it perfectly into your religious system, complete with ceremonies, myths, and generational teaching. That's not how humans work. Also, the Dogon weren't particularly interested in Europeans. They weren't sitting around asking for science lessons. They were preserving their own worldview. So we are left with an uncomfortable gap. Either the Dogon independently developed astronomical knowledge in a way we don't yet understand, or they inherited fragments of older knowledge from a civilization we haven't fully traced. Both options challenge the neat timeline we're taught. Why this history was buried. Here's the uncomfortable truth. You don't colonize powerful people with guns alone. You colonize them with stories. If Africans knew their ancestors built empires, negotiated with Europe as equals, and lost only because the rules of the game changed globally, submission becomes harder to justify. So the past had to be erased. Not completely. That would raise suspicion. Just enough. Reduce kingdoms to tribes. Reduce empires to folklore. Reduce resistance to chaos. And teach the colonized that they came from nothing. Here's what I want you to ask yourself now. If your starting point is, we were always behind, how ambitious do you allow yourself to be? Exactly. This history isn't about ego. It's about orientation. Knowing where you came from changes how you walk into rooms. What Europe feared most. Europe didn't fear African skin. That came later as justification. Europe feared African systems. Trade networks that didn't depend on Europe. States that didn't need European validation. Cultures that weren't impressed. That's why colonization wasn't just extraction. It was restructuring. Borders redrawn. Languages imposed. Education rewritten. Memory disrupted. Because memory is power. Why this matters now? You might be thinking, okay, this is interesting, but it's old. No. The stories we inherit shape the ceilings we accept. If Africa was always a catching up, then dependency feels natural. If Africa was once central and autonomous, then dependency feels artificial. And artificial things can be dismantled. Think about it this way. You don't rebuild a house until you remember what it looked like before it burned. The final question. I leave you with this. What would change if African children grew up knowing their ancestors forced Europe to negotiate, hesitate, and sometimes lose? Not propaganda. Not fantasy. Just truth. That question makes people uncomfortable. Which is how you know it matters. And that's why this story is only now being told again.